This was meant to be a simple hunting trip. I didn't expect the trip to go horribly wrong, and I don't think I ever want to go hunting, ever again. What we all thought was going to be a fun trip away from home in the woods, ends up turning into a fucking nightmare. This is something you don't want to experience, so I'm telling you this. If you see a strange-looking deer smiling at you, especially before nightfall, never stick around. We didn't listen, and that's something that will never leave my mind. A decision I most regret now. "Hey Lenny. You packed up yet?" yelled Mike, my friend since childhood. My name is Leonard Crow, but my friends usually call me Lenny. For short. My friend Mike, as I usually call him, was your typical, outdoors kind of guy. While he likes to keep to himself from time to time, he's also the guy that likes cracking jokes or playing sports. Not to mention he was a high school PE teacher back in Washington. Then there was my wife, Cynthia Crow. She was the love of my life. I'll never forget the day we first met, when I accidentally bumped into her at a clothes shop, and I was telling her what dress makes her look good. So yes, our first meeting started out silly and we started hanging out, until we became more than just friends. Of course, we didn't have any children yet, but we plan to in the next few years. Now, all I'm left with is a heartbroken reminder that this dream of having a family is taken from me by those demons in the woods. If I had listened to that old man, she would have still been alive, along with my friend and his 2 siblings. After I packed up, we all left for Okanogan National Forest. It was about 200 miles away from where I lived, so it would take us at least 4 hours to get there, maybe less considering the acceptable speed limit. There was me, my wife Cynthia, my friend Mike, and his 2 siblings, Earl and Richard. Of course, the drive to the woods wasn't that boring, as I enjoyed the spectacular view of the mountain, as well as being in places I haven't been to before. I was always the type to stay where I am, staying at my hometown, never venturing further out. After a few hours of driving, we reached the destination. It was 1 p.m. at the time. Luckily, there was a small roadhouse with a parking lot near the woods, so we decided to get some food before we head into the woods to set up camp. When we got in, there were some local, Native American tribesmen along with a few bikers from a motorcycle gang. Some of them didn't seem too happy to meet us, while others just minded their business. There was one tribesman who got my attention. He looked like he was in his mid-80s, and he was staring directly at me. As soon as I stared back at him, I felt this icy chill run down my spine, as if this guy knows us, or knows what will happen to us. Nevertheless, I turned away and gave the man no attention. After we got our food, we ate, drank, and talked about our early days, let alone hearing Mike crack a few jokes. After leaving a tip for the waitress, we left for the day and got our gear out of the trunk of the car. It was about 3 p.m. at the time, so we had plenty of time to set up camp, but we decided not to waste any time setting up. I figured after setting up, this will be a good way to get spectacular sceneries. As we got all of our gear and headed out, I heard yelling. It sounded like a language I never heard before. I turned to look where it came from, only to see 2 Native Americans and the old man looking at us. One of the younger tribesmen spoke in that same language to the elder, which caused the elder to walk toward us. I was a little freaked out by this at first, but as soon as the elder got close to us, he spoke to us in English. "Are you going to hunt?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Leave at nightfall, or they will come for you." I didn't expect such a warning from the old man at first, nor did we bother to consider it. We initially thought he was crazy when he told us about an evil spirit that haunts these woods at night. Both my friend and my wife, along with his siblings, decided to walk into the woods while I stayed to see what the tribal elder was saying. Upon telling me everything that happened in the woods, even to previous hunters who didn't heed his warning, I wanted to just chuckle it off and call him clinically insane. But I'm assuming that he knows I wasn't taking his words seriously. That's when he left me with this final warning. You will see many deer and goat during your hunting trip. But if you see a deer that does not look like a normal deer, and it smiles at you, that is your final warning. If you still refuse to heed, then may the ancestral spirits have mercy on you. That was his final words to me, before he turned and walked away back to the roadhouse. The other tribesmen shook their heads in disapproval to me, as if I refused to acknowledge these words. But I shrugged this off and went into the woods following Mike and the others, casting the whole ordeal from my mind. Now, I regret not heeding those words. I was a skeptic after all, never a true believer in the paranormal. I wouldn't believe it until I see it with my own eyes, so just a simple photo or video evidence of the paranormal is never enough to convince me. I suppose I'm a believer now, after the incident that happened. 3 hours before nightfall, after we finished setting up camp, I went out into the woods. I came across a river, gently flowing down the stream. I could even see several deer as well as a few goat off into the distance. It was a relaxing sight, and I was enjoying the fresh air. My wife suddenly appeared next to me. It shocked me that I didn't hear her coming, but I didn't question it. "A beautiful forest, isn't it?" she said, and I nodded to her in agreement. "I'm going to grab some snacks at the campsite. Be right back," I said to her, and she gave me a kiss on my cheek with a smile, before heading back. I walked to the campsite, and felt my face. Looking at my hand, I noticed a lipstick color on my hand, the same lipstick she always uses. She left a mark on my face, which I didn't mind since it was pleasant. After I got to the campsite, I noticed my friend and his siblings were still there, sitting down and talking. But out of our tent, came my wife, Cynthia. I smiled at her, and she looked and smiled back. That was when I realized something which made me frown. She was just with me by the river. When I left, she didn't follow me, nor did I see her following. "Hey, how did you get to the campsite so quick?" I asked her, and this made her confused. "Honey, I never left the campsite. I was in the tent this whole time setting up our bed," she replied. I felt a chill run through me. Who the hell was that I saw by the river? That person looked exactly like my wife. I ran back to the river, only to see there was no one there. Then I heard footsteps, and I turned to look, to see that my wife was following me. Then I noticed something off when I got a good look at my wife. She wasn't wearing any lipstick. That was when I became even more frightened. As she got closer, she saw the lipstick mark on my face, then she got furious. "Who the fuck did you meet by the river?" she yelled in anger. "It was you. That was you I saw by the river. I swear on my life, you were with me. That was why I asked how it was that you got to the campsite quicker than me." I explained. "I was in our tent the whole time." "That can't be possible," she said, with tears coming down her eyes. I immediately felt my heart pound rapidly, and my wife headed back to our tent, crying. What caught my attention was hearing my wife's footsteps. Why? Because I didn't hear them when she appeared next to me. After I headed back to the campsite, my friends and I set up a fire, along with a small grill to help cook food for dinner. My wife, on the other hand, wasn't joining us. She was still in the tent, crying. I tried talking to her, but she wouldn't speak to me. She assumed I was seeing someone, and lying about seeing my wife there, as she thought it was somebody else I was trying to cover for. Even though I told her the truth, it was not enough to convince her. After we started preparing food, my wife finally got out of the tent. "Hi honey," I said, but she looked at me with disgust and walked away into the forest without saying even a single word. "Just let it go, man. She'll cool off," Richard told me. I listened, so we focused on getting our dinner cooked for the night before bedtime, and we begin our hunt tomorrow. Me and the rest of the guys started chatting about how Mike and I first met in school, how we became best friends, and how I helped save his ass from a couple of bullies in school. Of course, at the time, he was your typical nerd in school. Now, he's someone you wouldn't want to fuck with, given that he got stronger, and he has a financially sound job even as a PE teacher. "How'd you go from a shitty, defenseless nerd to a macho motherfucker?" I jokingly asked. "Steroids," he said in a joking response, and we laughed. Shortly after, our laugh was cut off with a blood-curdling scream. "Cynthia," I yelled, recognizing that scream being my wife. Mike and I got up, and ran toward the direction of the scream, while Earl and Richard stayed to watch the food. After a few moments of running, we could see my wife, heading directly towards us. When she got close enough, I saw she looked very pale, and looked like she had woken up from an extremely horrible nightmare. Her eyes were wide with fear, while appearing bloodshot, but I understood she was still crying. She saw me, and immediately ran into my arms, crying even harder. "What happened?" I asked. "She looked like she's seen a ghost, that's what happened," Mike said. I don't like that deer," Cynthia muttered in tears. "What deer?" I asked anxiously. There was a deer, coming towards me from a distance. When I first noticed it, I thought it was just a deer. But it had no antlers, she said. "A doe, then. You probably thought it was supposed to have a set of antlers, but it didn't. So it made you freak out," I said out of stupidity, and this angered my wife. "I know doe usually don't have antlers, Leonard. This thing had black horns," she yelled. "Horns? You're saying that deer had horns, not antlers?" I asked. When it got close enough, I noticed it was smiling at me, with a smile that was stretching from ear to ear, and it had human eyes, she continued. This shook me to the core. Was there anything else unusual about this deer? I asked out of curiosity. The only thing I do remember is the deer looked like it was wearing lipstick or something on its mouth. Then it kept coming towards me, but it was making no sound. She then explained. I would freak out and scream if I ever saw that thing myself. Something seemed off, however. It was smiling? Also, the fact it appeared to be wearing some kind of lipstick brought yet another chill down my spine. I couldn't recall exactly what I also felt, but it had something to do with being warned about this. The other horrifying part that shook me was, it was making no sound upon approaching her. After a few moments of comforting her, we decided to head back to camp. I was happy to see Earl and Richard were okay, and they finished preparing the rest of the food for dinner. As nightfall crept in, we ate our food and got ready for bed early to prepare for the next day. I was in bed, laying down, but I couldn't sleep. The thought of what my wife told me kept plaguing my mind, losing sleep in the process. A deer with lipstick, black horns instead of antlers, coming to you without making any sound, smiling at you with an unnatural grin. Imagine that. Not something you would be pleased about if you ever go into the woods. Eventually, I fell asleep. I awoke to find myself standing outside of our tent. It was snowing outside, and everything was dark, even darker than how even the forest was considered to look during at night. It was also windy for some reason. I was walking around, trying to make sense of what was happening before me. I pulled out my phone and turned my phone's flashlight on. Then I turned to look at our tents, only to see that something had torn through them. It looked like claw marks of some kind. Maybe a bear? Then I noticed something. It looked reddish in color. As I walked closer to inspect it, I realized that this was blood. Blood? But from what? I looked through the hole in the tier, and noticed there was blood inside of it. Terror shot through me. I went to look through the hole, and saw something I wish I hadn't. I saw my wife, her eyes wide with fear, but they were soulless. She was dead. Her body appeared to have been ripped open. I backed away and saw the other tents had the same look. I did not need to look inside, as I understood the same thing happened to Mike and the others. I was immediately shot back to reality from the fear flooding my mind, by the sound of whimpering. The whimpering sounded like it came from farther out into the distance. Even though I couldn't see anything farther out, I walked towards the sound nevertheless, hoping to see if there was a survivor. As I walked more and more towards the sound, it was getting louder and louder. I could make out that it sounded like an old man, whimpering, as if something bad had occurred. When I finally got to the area of the sound, it stopped. I suddenly found myself where I stood before, by the river. Only this time, it was blood red instead of nice, crystal clear water. That's when I heard it again, only a few feet away from me. I turned to the sound, only to see an old man a few feet behind me. I jumped in fear, backing away until I stopped with the sudden realization if I backed any further, I would fall into the river of blood. "Hello?" I asked. Nothing came out of the old man's mouth other than the sound of whimpering. Then, a realization hit me. This was no ordinary old man. This was the tribal elder I encountered back at the roadhouse. This time, he looked a little different. His clothes were completely white, and his face appeared saddened, with a mix of a pity and despair. That's when my memories started flooding. The warning he gave, I did not heed them. Something was telling me we were all about to die. I was just about to head back to the tent, when the old man emitted a new noise. He sounded like he was in a bit of agony, and his face contorted into a horrifying look. His eyes were completely jet black, mouth wide open with just a black hole in them, and black liquid coming out of his eyes. He then threw what looked like a stick, on the ground next to my feet. I was horrified, and wanted to run as fast as I can. Suddenly, there was this strange chanting sound coming from where the tents were, followed by yet another blood-curdling scream. That's when the old man suddenly lifted his arm up, and pointed at the direction of the chanting sound. As I turned my flashlight to the direction, I noticed something in the distance. It looked like the shadow of a deer, but this time, something wasn't right. As the deer got closer and closer, I noticed a familiar appearance. It sported everything my wife told me about. The wide smile, the lack of sound, the lipstick-like smudge on its mouth, making no sound, having black horns instead of antlers, and it's heading towards me. I was terrified at the sight of it, before it stopped within several feet from my location. What happened next was something I wish I didn't lay eyes upon. This thing suddenly took on a more horrifying form. It stood upright, its face contorting into a very hideous appearance, its body suddenly becoming bulky, and replacing its two front hooves, were two hands with very sharp nails capable of ripping through a person's body with ease. Its eyes became a crimson red color. This thing looked like an unholy mix between a Wendigo and a demon. It gave off a hissing sound, before lunging at me, and I backed away, resulting in me falling into the river of blood. I suddenly woke up, drenched in sweat. I was relieved to see I was still in my tent, with my wife laying next to me. What a horrible nightmare. I thought to myself. I grabbed my phone, and I saw that the clock was at 1:30 a.m. About 6 more hours until time to hunt. I thought. I was about lay back in bed, trying to get a good night's sleep after that horrifying dream. As I slowly drifted off back into sleep, I heard something. It sounded like a loud hissing noise outside of our tent. I turned to the direction of that hissing noise, only to be met with a shadow of a tall figure on the other side. My eyes went wide with fear, and I was breathing heavily. The figure then looked like it was about to swipe at the tent. It made contact, and the tent was torn from that hit, leaving behind a tear. This caused my wife to wake up. She saw the tear in the tent, and then turned to look at me. "Honey, what happened?" she asked. I looked through the tear, only to see nothing on the other side. "Must have been a bear," I told her, but that was a lie in order to not scare her. I took my gun, and went outside to find out what caused that tear. Since it was snowing outside, I took my jacket. Mike, Earl, and Richard were all sleeping in their tents, so I was the only one up at the time. As I was looking around, I checked to see where the figure stood, only to see it left no tracks in the snow. As I continued onward, I noticed something. There was a set of tracks in the snow that lead to the river. This made no sense whatsoever. It wasn't snowing at the time of day, so I couldn't have left any tracks. Yet none of us walked toward the river at night even during the snow. I looked at the tracks, and noticed something that clutched onto my mind. This was not just any ordinary tracks. These were my tracks. I put my shoe down to make a footprint next to a print associated with the tracks, and sure enough, they were exactly the same. But how? That's when the dream came back to my mind. Was it really a dream? Nevertheless, I decided to take my gun and follow the tracks. Upon reaching the river, I noticed that the water was at least crystal clear, and not blood red like in the dream. However, when I turned to see where the old man stood in the dream, I saw something on the ground that made my heart pound rapidly. It was the stick the old man threw, and it was laying next to the print of someone standing in one place, which according to the dream, was me. I picked up the stick, and noticed that it was a very small stick, but it had a weird design to it. Not to mention its odd shape and appearance. This didn't look like any ordinary stick I've seen before. Then I heard something. It sounded like a woman screaming, followed by the screams of 3 men. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, I recognized those screams. It was everyone back at the tent. Worried, I put the stick in my pocket, and ran as fast as I could back to the campsite, to see what had happened. When I reached the destination, I was met with a grim sight. Not just one, but all 4 of the tents had tears in them, and they all had blood dripping, just like in the dream. I was suddenly knocked down by something. I turned to look, only to be met with an even more horrifying sight. It was that creature, and it gave a horrible growling sound, followed by that same hissing noise. Shocked and terrified, I stood up, pointed my gun at the creature, and started shooting at it. Tried as much as I could, my bullets didn't do shit to the creature. It just kept walking towards me after every shot I took. As the creature got close enough, it lifted its arm up and swiped at me. I jumped away as quick as I could, but the scratch made contact with my chest, leaving a rip in my shirt and blood staining it. My eyes were closed from the pain I was feeling, but when I opened them, the creature disappeared out of sight. I felt relieved, but only for a moment, thinking that it might come back to hurt me. I got up and decided fuck this. And went to grab the keys to my friend's car. When I went into his tent to get the keys, I saw that his body had been horribly mangled. After a couple of minutes, I found the keys and headed back to the car. I couldn't run unfortunately, given that the pain was unbearable. As I was making my way back to the car, I heard a snap behind me. I turned to look and see if the creature was there, only to see nothing. But just at that instant, I was knocked away. I found myself flying towards the campsite. I turned to see that the creature was several feet away, looking directly at me. I began to think I was about to die next, never getting out of the forest, feeling like I lost all hope, a thought hit me. I instinctively grabbed the small stick out and decided to use my lighter to light it up. It was useless in the snowy outside, so I went in the tent, while the creature was heading towards me. As I went in my tent, I saw my wife the same way I saw her in the dream. I wanted to cry, but I immediately realized I had no time. Once I got my lighter going, I lit the stick just in time, right before the creature ripped off the top of our tent. Just when I thought I would meet my fate, I could smell an interesting scent coming from that stick. It wasn't exactly a pleasant smell, but it wasn't bad either. The creature started waving its hand around its face, as if it didn't like the smell. It then ran off into the distance. Astonished by what just happened, I was about to put out the stick, but something told me not to. I then remembered the creature's reaction, so I decided to keep it lit while I head back to the car. Just as I was walking, the pain on my chest was becoming more and more unbearable, and I felt like I was about to pass out. Just then, I felt something grab onto me. Horrified as I was walking, I turned to look, only to see it was a hand, and that's when I saw Cynthia, who appeared to be fine, and she was walking me to the car. What caught my attention was the tribal elder next to her. When I turned to look back, I saw the car was a few moments away. I could see the roadhouse, and it was closed, but there were a few bikers hanging out nearby, and they all started looking at me. When I got close to the car, I turned to my wife, and I see her smiling at me, right before blackness took over. I fell onto the road, and I can vaguely hear sounds of yelling nearby. I awoke to the sound of a machine, and I found myself laying on a bed, with bandages covering my wounds. I looked around to see where my wife was, but she wasn't there with me. After what felt like a few minutes, one of the doctors came into my room and was surprised to see I was awake. "You were out for 2 days, Mr. Crow. Glad to see you're awake," the doctor said with a smile. "But where's my wife?" I asked her, and she gave me a look of confusion. "Mr. Crow, I'm sorry to say this. But Cynthia, your wife, she's dead. She's been dead for over 2 days now," she said. "But that was impossible. I just saw her walk me to the car. How could she be dead?" I thought this until I remembered her mangled appearance at the tent. Was that really her, or was that the creature pretending to be her again? As I pondered on this, another doctor came in the room and told me I have a visitor who claims to know me. Thinking it must have been Earl or Richard that escaped, I told the doctor to let him visit me. Instead, I was greeted by one of the local tribesmen from the roadhouse earlier, the one associated with the tribal elder. Looking at his face, I noticed he was saddened. "Why are you here?" I asked him. "My name is Pyatt, and I'm here because my grandfather had passed away in this hospital," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss, but what does this have to do with me?" I asked out of curiosity. His next few words struck me. "He passed away, saving you," Pyatt said. "You mean the old man back at the roadhouse?" I asked. "He's not an old man. He was the chief of our tribe. He was my grandfather. He's gone now," he said. "I'm sorry, I should have Lee." "Don't bother," Pyatt said, cutting me off. "It comes as no surprise as to how ignorant outsiders can be, until it happens to you. You weren't the first to have gone into the forest without ever heeding my grandfather's warning." He said this before leaving my room. While I was lucky to get out, the unimaginable guilt I had, that I was saved by the tribal elder in the end, only to be paid at a terrible cost, stayed etched into my mind. It also doesn't change the fact that I was so ignorant of his warning, that I could have saved my wife, as well as my friend Mike, along with his siblings, whom I found out had also been found dead with their bodies viciously torn apart. Now, here I am back at home, and I'm writing this to you all, not only as the story of what happened, but also as a warning. If you ever decide to go hunting at Okanogan National Forest, never stay there at nightfall, or else, it will come for you.